Welcome everyone. My name is Philip Murphy. I'm director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. Sometimes fate smiles on a particular conference or event, and it certainly has in this case. A huge amount of time and effort has gone into planning this conference. And when the process started, we couldn't really have predicted what would be going on this day, the 10th of June, 2021. But as it happens, in an event dripping with perhaps rather heavy-handed symbolism, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden will meet today on the fringes of the G7 meeting to sign what's being styled as a new Atlantic Charter to tackle a series of global challenges. The symbolism clearly matters deeply to both sides, although not necessarily equally. For Biden, it is a chance to assert that America is back on the world stage as a constructive influence after all the turmoil of the Trump years. And for Johnson, although Johnson has been interestingly a little bit cautious about using this familiar term special relationship, the relationship clearly matters hugely to the Johnson government and to Britain at the moment, so-called global Britain, in the wake of Brexit. But even before the announcement came that this so-called new Atlantic Charter was being signed, one could sense the buzz in the air in the UK that an American president was visiting. America has exerted such an extraordinary influence over Britain's external policies in the post-war period. And that is partly what this conference is going to be looking at, but more broadly, using the 1941 Atlantic Charter as a jumping off point. It's going to explore how some of those legacies of the European empires and the breakup of those empires continues to shape global affairs today. And that, in recent years, has been perhaps the key research focus of my institute, the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And it continues to attract extraordinary both scholarly and public attention. In the course of that research focus, we've been blessed by having Milani as one of our senior research fellows at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And Milani has helped convene a series of conferences and events, bringing together scholars from the UK, from France, and from the rest of the world. And I would say that, again, in the wake of Brexit, those European links matter to us more than they ever did before. And I really welcome this collaboration. In terms of the subject matter of the event, those notions of sovereignty and self-determination firmly embedded in the 1941 Atlantic Charter, of course, resonated throughout the post-war world. And again, this is going to be a key focus in our study today, and they resonate right through to the current Brexit negotiations, which unfortunately are far from over. And it's good to see that represented in the conference as well. So thank you so much to Milani, to the University of Picardie, Jules Verne, for organizing this event with us. To all our speakers, to our keynote speaker, Stuart Ward, who will be speaking tomorrow morning. And without further ado, I'd just like to hand over to Milani to say a few more words of introduction.
Thank you very much, Philip, for this very kind introduction, and also very interesting introduction. Sort of setting the more immediate and more global, at the same time, sort of context for this conference. And thank you very much, for working with us on this. I was reflecting the other day that the last time I was fortunate enough to be physically at a workshop was back in November 2019 at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And Tommaso, who will be speaking today, was with us as well. So I think that the Institute as a space to develop ideas, to exchange, to really sort of go to the heart of a number of important academic, but also more global, I suppose, sort of societal issues has been, and hopefully will remain, will continue to be extremely important. I would also like to extend our thanks to all of the speakers, but also to the organising team, Adrien, Amal, Elias and Mark. It's been very nice putting this together, and it's been a real sort of collaborative project. I won't be long. I guess one thing I was going to say is that it's, I think, quite also not sure whether significant is quite the right term, but I think that the fact that the conference is in partnership with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies makes a lot of sense, because I think from the paper proposals we've had, from the discussions we've had amongst ourselves as well, when we put together the call for papers, there was also this sense that the Commonwealth was at the heart of several of the trends that we wanted to investigate. And at present, and this is linked to what Philip was saying, it's at the heart of a lot of the political rhetoric that is being used in relation to Brexit and more generally to foreign affairs. And it's very good that several of the papers, I think, will seek to sort of unpack this rhetoric. And I think we're also going to be delving into, what meaning it has for British politicians, perhaps how this meaning has evolved over the years, but also what place it has in current reassessments in Britain of the place of the colonial, the legacies of empire, but not just the legacies, the ways also in which empire and older versions of the Commonwealth still manifest themselves in contemporary Britain, but also the ways as well in which sort of older forms of empire might still exist. And I'm hoping that the roundtable later on this evening will also sort of lead us into these questions. So it's been a real pleasure working on the organisation of this conference, and I'm hoping that for everyone it will also be a pleasure attending these 2 days. We know it's an extremely busy period of the academic year, so we're particularly grateful that you've proposed papers or you're here with us to discuss these issues. So I think that probably without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague Adrien from the University of Versailles-Saint-Quentin, who's also been one of the key organisers of this conference, and so I'll hand over to him to chair our first panel of the conference. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Milani. So I won't repeat the warm words of welcome, but I do welcome you all to this first panel of our conference, in which we'll be looking at principles and practices of British international policy in terms of ruptures and of continuities since, of course, the Atlantic Charter, so since 1941. And we'll be progressing through time as you will see with our 3 papers on this panel from those early years of the 1940s right up until the present day. So our first speaker, Tommaso Milani, is a historian at the European University Institute near Florence, though he has also been a lecturer at Balliol College, Oxford, and at Sciences Po, Paris. His research focuses mainly on differing models of economic policy as applied to the early 20th century, and the role of intellectuals in politics in Western Europe. Now, he's taught international, European, and Cold War history. And last year, he published the book, Hendrik de Man and Social Democracy, The Idea of Planning in Western Europe, 1914 to 1940, on the impact on Western European social democracy of the ideas of Belgian socialist intellectual and politician Hendrik de Man. Now, of course, today's conference covers the period which begins just after that, just after 1940. And Tommaso's presentation will be looking at left-wing historian E.H. Carr's book, Conditions of Peace, written in 1941, published the following year, and will present it to us in relation to the Atlantic Charter. So the floor is yours, Tommaso.
Thank you. Just let me try to share my screen. For practical reasons, I will turn off my camera, and then you will be able to see, hopefully, my slides. Okay. Can you see them? Great. So thank you, Adrien, and thank you to the entire organizing committee for having me. It is a genuine pleasure to be with you, if only virtually, and have the opportunity to kick off this fascinating and timely 2-day conference. I hope you can hear me loud and clear.
Yes.
Beginning an investigation of the afterlives of the Atlantic Charter by examining a best-selling book on international affairs, published less than 6 months after the Charter's release, seems quite appropriate. It is well documented that the joint statement issued by President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill in the summer of 1941 was widely debated in the press, generating a wave of publications aimed at praising its merits, or less frequently at underscoring its limitations, ambiguities, and flaws. As Elizabeth Borgward has convincingly shown, the Atlantic Charter had a profound impact on the redefinition of the language of liberal internationalism throughout the 1940s, and on the projection of the principles, values, and rhetoric of the New Deal onto the global stage. Its extensive, multifaceted reception by contemporary observers, especially within the English-speaking world, provides ample evidence of this. Yet, the book we will focus on this morning, Conditions of Peace, not only refrained from engaging with the provisions of the Charter in any significant detail, but set out a vision that in many respects diverged quite sharply from the basic tenets underpinning that document. While, as I will try to explain, its author's views should not be regarded as necessarily hostile to extensive Anglo-American cooperation in specific sectors and areas of policy, it remains that E.H. Carr's emphasis on Britain's regional responsibilities towards Europe and desire to see his country embrace collectivism at home and abroad, thereby offering a landmark contribution to the renewal of the foundations of post-war European democracies, set him on a different and perhaps even more ambitious course from the one proposed by many advocates of Atlanticism. Carr's book can be interpreted both as a follow-up to his previous highly controversial work on international relations, The 20 Years' Crisis, first published in September 1939, and as the intellectual high point of his role as assistant editor of the Times, a position he took up in January 1941 and held until July 1946. While the approach he followed combined a more empirical outlook in the first part of the book with a normative one in the second part, Conditions of Peace, as Peter Wilson noted, can be seen as a reply to his critics in its eagerness to begin the work of construction following the demolition job of the 20 Years' Crisis. That Conditions of Peace had the ambition of overcoming Carr's own polemical and consciously artificial opposition between realism and idealism is confirmed also by the autobiographical note Carr penned in 1980, 2 years before his death. The war, Carr wrote, and I quote, came as a shock which numbed the thinking process. One became suddenly occupied with day-to-day problems. I was plunged into the Ministry of Information and then into the Times, was content to follow the official line, and for a time stopped thinking at all. Nothing seemed to make sense. Then, like a lot of other people, I took refuge in utopian visions of a new world after the war. After all, it was on the basis of such vision that a lot of real constructive work was done, and Churchill lost sympathy by being openly impatient of them. I began to be a bit ashamed of the harsh realism, into commas, of 20 Years' Crisis, and in 1940-1941 wrote the highly utopian Conditions of Peace, a sort of liberal utopia, mixed with a little socialism, but very little Marxism. It was my most popular book to date because it caught the current mood, but it was pretty feeble. Nationalism and After, which I wrote towards the end of the war, was better, but still had utopian elements, end of quote. Contemporary sources corroborate Carr's recollections about the period during which the book came into being. According to an introductory note published in the first edition of Conditions of Peace, its general shape had been determined, and much of it had been written before the entry of Soviet Russia into the war, while the manuscript was already in press when Japan and the United States of America joined the ranks of the belligerent. Very much a product of its times, Conditions of Peace was nonetheless an original and thought-provoking book, selling around 15,000 copies between 1942 and 1943 alone, and being widely reviewed, commented on, and even denounced in the House of Lords. As an American left-wing intellectual pointed out, its main thesis alarmed many readers while it fascinated them. Summarizing a 280-page book in a few minutes would require a tour de force. Yet the thrust of the main argument lying at the core of Conditions of Peace is clear and easy to pin down. Carr contended that the Second World War, far from being an accident of history, was the byproduct of both the deeply inadequate Versailles settlement and of a series of crises undermining the philosophical, economic, and moral foundations of modern democracy, all symptomatic of a revolutionary period marked by the rise of collectivistic tendencies. The backward-looking view of the satisfied powers, as Carr put it, that had hampered the search for more imaginative solutions to Europe's problems in 1919 also permeated the economic and social realm, as post-war leaders failed to envisage viable alternatives to a dull restoration of 19th century laissez-faire when charting a path to prosperity. According to Carr, the inability to adjust democratic institutions to an era of growing centralization, bureaucratization, and cartelization had left democracy exposed to its enemies, resulting into an exponential increase of the popularity of totalitarian methods of government and control over private monopolies. In order to survive, Carr held, democracy had to abandon its still prevailing individualistic mindset and foster a new faith, centered on the common good, self-sacrifice, and the recognition of fundamental social and economic rights as core elements of citizenship. A fresh synthesis that could draw on the values of communism as well as of those of Christianity. The second part of Conditions of Peace claimed that post-war Europe could provide ample space for experimentation in the area of democratic planning, insofar as Britain agreed to assume a leading role in its reconstruction. In a string of visionary, mind-blowing chapters, Carr analyzed the alleged benefits that would derive from the pursuit of social reform at home, including the launching of public works programs, the pursuit of planned consumption, the creation of a mixed economy, and so on, as well as from an enlightened and positive policy towards post-war Europe, wherein only the gradual pooling of sovereignty would offer a durable antidote to the resurgence of the German problem. Through the workings of a wide range of agencies, the most important of which, a European planning authority, would be tasked with the maintenance of equal and universally raising living standards across the entire continent, Carr predicted economic nationalism would be eventually uprooted and stability ensured. Had the other great powers, namely the United States and the Soviet Union, thrown their weight behind these new technocratic bodies and helped their launching, these would have soon gained the confidence of the European people, becoming the seedbed of a new, no longer state-centric international order. Interestingly enough, the Atlantic Charter is never openly referred to in Carr's book. And ultimately, one can only speculate about the extent to which Carr's blueprint differed from the Charter's goals. However, even a cursory reading of Conditions of Peace allows to identify three major issues on which Carr's ideas clashed with that which, for practical purposes, we may call an Atlanticist orientation. First, Conditions of Peace contains a powerful indictment of the principle of national self-determination, especially when applied to small states, whereas, as we know, the Atlantic Charter forcefully reasserted it. By decoupling the principle of self-determination from that of nationality, Carr maintained that the free will of people was not bound to bring about the creation of independent nation units, and that conceptual mistake had heavily contributed to crippling the Versailles peace treaties. In the words of Carr, and I quote, "Having proclaimed unqualified independence for all nations as a principal Allied war aim, and having fostered the growth of a maximum number of independent national units, Allied leaders sincerely believed that these dispersed fragments could be induced by their own interest to reunite into unit of common obligation. It was a policy of self-contradiction and self-frustration. The settlement of 1919 was planned in terms of the nation unit. Our task must be to plan from the first in terms of the wider framework." End of quote. Nothing along these lines, of course, could be found in the Atlantic Charter. Second, Carr repeatedly underscored the necessity of planning international trade and criticized the United States for its, and I quote, "fanatical and purposeless devotion to the obsolete doctrine of most favored nation treatment," end of quote. A conception that the Atlantic Charter seemed to bow to by stating the will to ensure access on equal terms to trade and to raw materials to all nations of the world. By and large, while praising specific aspects of the New Deal, Carr warned that, and I quote, "While nearly all Americans ardently desire to see greater unity in Europe, and frequently express surprise and indignation at the lack of it, the unguarded and unqualified reiteration by leading Americans of 19th century slogans sometimes seems calculated to hamper the chances of bringing it about," end of quote. Third, Carr was deeply uncomfortable with the idea that the future of Britain as a world power would hinge upon a special relationship with Washington, let alone a willingness to follow Washington's lead in world affairs. As Carr argued, and I quote, "One of the gravest dangers ahead is that American influence will be employed to frame a peace settlement of a character which could be maintained only by American power, and that American power will not, in fact, be available to maintain it," end of quote. Even though Carr did acknowledge the existence of close cooperation and consciousness of common interests and policy between the two countries at the time he wrote his book, he expressed reservations about the possibility that these exceptional conditions would endure also in peacetime. And while he wished the United States could and would contribute to stabilizing the post-war order, Conditions of Peace featured also sharp remarks on how American ignorance of political conditions abroad and irresponsible foreign policy, all these are direct quotations, could actually end up undermining it. I would like to conclude my presentation by highlighting a few additional reasons why Conditions of Peace still deserves attention and close reading by historians interested in studying Britain's evolving position in the world. Although, as we have heard, Carr himself later came to dismiss the book as far-fetched and almost quixotic in its aims, it is worth stressing that some of the key points he made in early 1942 were not only well-grounded in fact, but almost prophetic as they harbingered developments and controversies occurring during the subsequent decades. Both Carr's scathing criticism of European constitutional approach to federalism and defense of functionalist integration, for instance, largely foreshadowed debates taking place within and around the European movement in the late 1940s. Whereas his call for the reintegration of Germany in the post-war order was informed by a prescient understanding of the strategic predicament Britain would face in a politically fragmented and economically depressed Central and Eastern Europe. More generally, in insight, scholars may be struck less by the impracticability than by the overall plausibility of Carr's grand design, whatever its shortcomings and incorrect assumptions it rested upon. While one could argue that at the end of the Second World War, the historical roots, emotional appeal, and ideological flexibility of Atlanticism enabled the champions of closer Anglo-American relations to gain the upper hand over advocates of Britain's European vocation on a number of fundamental issues, it holds true that decision makers were nonetheless compelled by forces and events beyond their control to pursue a more constructive, imaginative, and positive policy towards Europe than their predecessors. While Britain's degree of involvement with Europe remained an unsettled question, subject to constant redefinition and renegotiation, Atlanticism came to mean something profoundly different from a return to splendid isolation, for it paved the way to a policy of benevolent detachment first, later to be supplanted by direct engagement and even membership in European organizations. And for once, Carr's warning that, and I quote, "Those who desire the maintenance of British power must accept the inevitability of British commitments in Europe," end of quote, did not fall on deaf ears. I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And thank you for fitting your presentation in exactly 20 minutes. And thanks for this very interesting historical and intellectual framework to some of the issues that we'll be exploring during the rest of this conference. Now, I suggest that if you have questions, just keep them in mind for now, or note them, scribble them down somewhere, and we'll come to questions at the end of the panel. In case some of the questions can be, addressed from several perspectives, from the perspectives of several of our participants and of several different periods. So we'll turn now to our second paper for this panel by David Grealy, who is an associate lecturer in history at Lancaster University. He holds a PhD from the University of Liverpool on the topic of human rights and British diplomacy, 1977 to 1994, intellectual biography of David Owen. And his wider research interests include diplomatic history, global intellectual history, human rights and humanitarianism. Now he'll be talking to us now about the UK's human rights diplomacy under Foreign Secretary David Owen, so in the late 1970s, and how it fitted within the always complex triangle of relations between Britain, the European community, and the United States, notably or including on issues of self-determination and the situation within Eastern Europe. So, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adrien. And thank you once again to Melanie and the rest of the organisers of this conference for inviting me to participate in what is going to be a fascinating and timely event. So I'm just going to try and share my slides. Hopefully you can see that now.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so within the rapidly expanding historiography on human rights and the evolution of human rights diplomacy during the second half of the 20th century, British foreign policy perspectives remain largely underappreciated. As regards the striking elevation of human rights concerns within international discourse during the 1970s, existing coverage has tended to focus on the purported skepticism that predominated within Whitehall. This skepticism, it has been maintained, became particularly pronounced following President Jimmy Carter's declaration that international human rights promotion would become a central theme of his presidency. This, however, is only part of the story. Indeed, following David Owen's unexpected appointment as Foreign Secretary in February 1977, he became arguably the most vocal champion of Carter's human rights policy to be found within the NATO Council of Foreign Ministers. The contemporaneous elevation of the human rights question within the Foreign Office, furthermore, would play an important role in shaping the Callaghan government's response to a multiplicity of foreign policy dilemmas during Owen's tenure as Foreign Secretary. This paper will explore how Owen's amplification of Britain's human rights policy came to reflect the enduring appeal of the so-called Anglo-American special relationship, as well as the anxieties that surrounded Britain's contested reorientation towards Europe following its entry into the European Community in 1973. Whereas Owen's support of Carter's human rights policy served to position the Callaghan government shoulder to shoulder with the Carter administration, Owen's human rights stance only exacerbated tensions within the European community, with several member states feeling that Carter's heavy-handed management of the human rights question within the context of the East-West dialogue could disrupt détente and undo the progress made by the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Although the UK government's concerted efforts to codify human rights provisions within the Lomé Convention indicate that the EC was indeed a valued forum within which UK influence in the human rights field could be amplified, these tensions can be seen to reinforce Britain's status as an awkward partner within the community, illuminate the schisms that have recently developed within the Foreign Office regarding Britain's attenuated commitment to the European project, and provide a fresh perspective on Britain's enduring search for a distinctive post-colonial international role. The establishment of human rights provisions within the context of the East-West dialogue through the Helsinki Accords, the entry into force of the 2 UN covenants on human rights, and the rapid proliferation of human rights NGOs and transnational activist networks together raised international human rights awareness to an unprecedented level during the 1970s. Indeed, the decade has been widely recognized as a breakthrough moment in human rights history. Perhaps the clearest indication of the growing influence of human rights norms within international discourse during this period was the intrusion of human rights into the diplomacy of Western states, typified by the crusading example set by the administration of President Jimmy Carter in the United States. Because we are free, Carter stated during his inaugural address in January 1977, we can never be indifferent to the fate of freedom elsewhere. Our moral sense dictates a clear-cut preference for those societies which share with us an abiding respect for individual human rights. Weeks later, the recently appointed 38-year-old UK Foreign Secretary, David Owen, took steps to follow President Carter's example. During his first major speech as Foreign Secretary, delivered on the 3rd of March, Owen stated that Britain would take a stand on human rights in every corner of the globe. We will not discriminate, Owen continued. We will apply the same standards and judgments to communist countries as we do to Chile, Uganda, and South Africa. President Carter, whose obvious concern for the whole area of human rights is crucially important, has made it clear that this will also be the attitude of his administration. Bearing in mind that this address was delivered a week before Owen and Prime Minister Jim Callaghan were scheduled to depart for Washington, it is little wonder that some commentators were quick to interpret Owen's human rights initiative as an act of sheer opportunism, a convenient means of ingratiating the Labour government with the Carter administration. After all, following a cooling of Anglo-American relations during the early 1970s, the Labour governments of Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan appeared eager to rejuvenate the so-called special relationship between the two nations and to repair the damage inflicted by the Conservative government of Edward Heath, who had focused his energies on European integration. Subsequent cooperation between Washington and London in the human rights field, however, indicates that Owen's human rights initiative was more than a mere public relations exercise. In addition to coordinating human rights initiatives in the UN, close and harmonious consultation can be observed with regards to the position the two countries would adopt at the CSCE follow-up conference in Belgrade. Owen also established a constructive dialogue with Patricia de Ryan, Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, with a view to identifying the areas of human rights policy in which, quote, the United States government would like British assistance or a more active British stance. Cooperation in the human rights field even served to mitigate US criticism of the Callaghan government over the suspension of civil liberties in Northern Ireland amid ongoing sectarian conflict in the region. According to one US diplomat who worked closely with the London Embassy as a political officer between 1977 and 1980, we were able, if I may say so, to avoid meddling on human rights grounds. We were very careful not to tell the British what to do or to imply that it was a so-called humanitarian issue. For one thing, we would have been preaching to the converted about human rights. Following Owen's appointment as Foreign Secretary then, a prevailing sense of mutual commitment to human rights promotion can be seen to reflect and indeed expedite the process of Anglo-American rapprochement initiated by Labour's return to power in 1974. An analysis of the impact the Callaghan government's human rights policy had on UK-EC relations at this juncture, however, indicates that the Foreign Secretary's human rights initiative exerted a decidedly schismatic influence within the community. On the 11th of March, 1977, the Times noted that whereas Owen's public adoption of the human rights cause was widely interpreted as a display of solidarity with President Carter's foreign policy approach, French and German appraisals of Carter administration diplomacy were conspicuous by their absence. Weeks later, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Helmut Schmidt, conveyed his reservations privately to US Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, pointing out the potentially disastrous impact of Carter's human rights crusade on the ongoing attempts to extricate ethnic Germans from the Soviet Union. French attitudes, it would appear, were no less skeptical. A Foreign Office memo circulated prior to an EC ministerial meeting on human rights issues in April notes that the French wish to keep their hands free and not to be swept along, as they fear might happen, in a direction chosen arbitrarily by President Carter. Owen's enthusiastic support for Carter's human rights policy, however, had hardly fostered transatlantic understanding. As the US Embassy in London reported, Owen's human rights stance constituted a unilateral declaration of British foreign policy that was not coordinated or otherwise discussed with Britain's EC partners before delivery. It is therefore understandable that a perception began to develop among Britain's community partners that the UK was too eager to position itself side by side with the Carter administration in the human rights field to take heed of European anxieties, particularly over human rights in the context of the East-West dialogue. Owen's public statements certainly did little to disabuse anyone of this notion, framing human rights as a distinctly Anglophone concept, an outgrowth of a shared philosophical inheritance which bound Britain and the United States tighter than any other Western democracies. During a July 1977 appearance on the US television program Face the Nation, for instance, Owen accepted that President Carter's human rights campaign had created a sense of unease within Western Europe, but encouraged viewers to recognize that every country is going to handle human rights differently. Britain is going to be different than other Western European countries, Owen stated, because it's got, in a way, the same sort of tradition to individual freedom and moral stance in foreign policy as the United States. And so I find that aspect of President Carter's foreign policy deeply attractive. France, I think, has a different style on these sorts of issues. It has a different attitude to civil liberties. I don't think it's a strongly felt issue in some regards, as it is, for instance, in Britain. It seems that Italy, too, has a different response. Behind closed doors, Owen also displayed a degree of reticence when it came to the prospect of coordinating UK human rights policy with its European associates. In response to the suggestion that Britain ought to discuss its ideas in the human rights field with EC members, Owen stated that he wanted any British initiative to be kept in British hands. It was not, in his opinion, necessary to do everything with the Nine. This conviction, it would appear, was rooted in his essentially Churchillian conception of Britain's overseas role, which held that Britain was not an exclusively European power, but was, in spite of its post-war decline, still capable of exerting a unique influence in international affairs by dint of its situation at the nexus of three interconnected relationships: the United States, Europe, and the Commonwealth. Owen, however, felt that this triumvirate had become imbalanced as emphasis had shifted towards facilitating Britain's integration into the European community following its entry in 1973. As he explained to the Sunday Times, "We have got into a mood of self-denigration and a feeling that we have lost our buoyancy. In the very necessary reorientation of our policy towards Europe, we have swung the pendulum so that there is a danger of restricting our horizons." This impression had been reinforced during the early days of Owen's tenure as Foreign Secretary through his encounters with senior diplomats who were, quote, "reluctant to embark on any course which put us at serious loggerheads with the majority of community members." Owen goes on to identify these diplomats as Euro-federalists who believed in an eventual United States of Europe and thought of this as a higher calling than the more mundane task of fighting the British corner. Therefore, questions regarding the appropriate degree to which the UK should consult with its EC partners on human rights issues and the extent to which it should support the approach of the Carter administration, which had clearly antagonized some community members, cannot be so easily extricated from larger debates concerning Britain's contested reorientation towards Europe, nor should they be viewed in isolation from the Labour Party's historic tendency towards Euroscepticism. Indeed, in December 1977, when Parliamentary Secretary Evan Luard echoed Owen's objection to the notion that the UK should coordinate its human rights policy with the rest of the Nine, the debate seemingly became entangled with long-standing anxieties surrounding Britain's enduring ambivalence towards the European project and the division between Labour ministers and Foreign Office officials over the prioritisation of European cooperation on foreign policy issues. "I am not against consulting with the Nine and trying to get their support for our ideas if possible," Luard stated. "But at least in the human rights field, I do not think that it should have absolute priority. Like one or two other FCO ministers, I believe, though a committed European, that the objective of keeping in step with the Nine at all costs perhaps plays an excessively dominant part in the thinking of officials here on many issues at present. We should consider first what our aims are in human rights, and then how far we can win support from the Nine, not vice versa." It would, however, be unfair to suggest that Britain was any less committed to human rights promotion within the forums of the European community than the rest of the Nine during David Owen's tenure as Foreign Secretary. On the contrary, the Callaghan government would find itself facing an uphill struggle in its attempts to ensure the insertion of human rights provisions within the renegotiated Lomé Convention, which regulated the community's economic relations with African, Caribbean, and Pacific ACP countries. The British desire to insert a human rights clause within the renegotiated convention, signed in 1975 and scheduled for renewal in 1980, had developed as a response to the EC's inability to suspend aid to Uganda in 1976, in spite of the gross human rights abuses that were being perpetrated by the Idi Amin regime. Supporters of the proposition within the community, however, were few and far between. French and German representatives articulated their misgivings during an informal meeting of EC foreign ministers in October 1977. As the debate progressed over the course of the following year, skepticism increasingly became a consensus position within the community. By the summer of 1978, UK representatives had managed to find support for their endeavour by consulting with Dutch representatives, and the two governments can be seen to coordinate their attempts to modify the community's position during the weeks and months that followed. Even still, it would appear that the UK's commitment far outstripped that of its Dutch collaborators. As negotiations gathered speed in the spring of 1979, their support began to fade, and their acquiescence to the community's pervasive scepticism was noted with disappointment within the Foreign Office. In light of the lack of support behind the UK's push for the insertion of an operative human rights clause in Lomé II, the fact that the renegotiated convention contained no such provision is hardly surprising. As such, it is also misleading to suggest, as one Overseas Development Institute briefing paper does, that the EC wanted more than a casual reference to basic UN principles inserted in the new convention, and that the human rights clause was, quote, quietly dropped during negotiations due to the objections of ACP countries. Rather, the Callaghan government had been swimming against the tide in its attempts to codify human rights considerations within Lomé II, which was eventually signed on the 31st of October, 1979. Whereas the Callaghan government's stubbornness had somewhat been a thorn in the side of the EC during its internal negotiations, the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher, which came to power following the general election of May 1979, would prove to be far more attentive to the concerns of its community partners. It decided to adopt what it referred to as a more pragmatic approach, which led to the rapid downgrading of the human rights issue within the context of the Lomé Convention. In fact, it was not until the entry into force of its fourth iteration in 1989 that a substantive human rights clause would feature in the convention. So what conclusions can be drawn from Britain's unilateral amplification of its human rights diplomacy and its implications vis-a-vis key relationships with the United States and the European community? During David Owen's tenure as Foreign Secretary between 1977 and 79, a period which witnessed a breakthrough for human rights in international discourse, tensions clearly arose over Britain's desire to pursue a distinctive role in the human rights field. These became particularly pronounced within the European community due to Britain's support for President Carter's potentially destructive initiatives in the human rights field that threatened to impair the progress of the CSCE and disrupt the delicate balance of détente. In order to understand this somewhat cavalier approach, Owen's human rights initiative must be viewed as a microcosm of a much larger debate, contested between those who believe that Britain's future lay exclusively within Europe and those like Owen, who, in spite of his post-colonial vintage, continued to cleave to a decidedly Churchillian conception of Britain's overseas role, maintaining that Britain's unique influence on the international stage derived from its situation at the nexus of three interconnected spheres: the United States, Europe, and the Commonwealth. Although the development of negotiations surrounding the Lomé Convention demonstrate the value accorded to the European community as a forum within which British influence in the human rights field could be augmented, these tensions ultimately serve to highlight the precarity of Britain's status as a European power and reinforce its reputation as an awkward partner within the community, ensuring that Britain's human rights-based foreign policy would be constructed with only one eye across the Channel, the other trained firmly on developments in Washington.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for that presentation. So again, if you can just hold on to your questions for a moment, because we're going to continue to see how these issues of relations have progressed through time, up to and including the Brexit period, as we turn now to our third paper for this panel. So Louise Dalingwater is a professor of British politics at the Sorbonne Université in Paris. Her current research focuses on trade in services, health and well-being in the United Kingdom. She co-edited the recent publication, Understanding Mega Trade Deals, the Political and Economic Governance of New Cross-Regionalism, and also co-edited the special section, The Dynamics of Inclusion and Exclusion in Trade Politics, in the journal New Political Economy. So after issues in British international policy in the 1940s and 1970s and the framing of those complex triangular relations, Louise's presentation takes us to the current Brexit era and to the question of whether Britain outside Europe is indeed taking back control, or whether the government's much touted pursuit of free trade agreements around the world may not also inherently require compromises in terms of sovereignty. So Louise, over to you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and thank you to the organisers for this really stimulating conference. So I'll just share my screen now. So since the UK withdrew from the EU, it has signed a significant number of agreements and trade deals. The new free trade agreements, FTAs, which are necessary if Britain is to regain international markets after its departure from the EU, may actually well call into question Britain's sovereign powers. FTAs are no longer just about free trade. There are a whole number of behind the border issues related to the political and social spheres that are now included in these comprehensive deals. And the wide scope of comprehensive trade deals today has even led some commentators to question whether free trade deals are actually really free at all. So the take back control rhetoric that we're all familiar with actually lacks a depth of understanding and knowledge of the actual impact of FTAs on sovereign states. So through this conceptual paper, I'm seeking to discuss through extensive analysis of FTAs, although only partially today in this presentation, presented today in this presentation, which have been signed by the UK or are in progress, to look how the new landscape of comprehensive and progressive trade agreements may actually call into question notions of sovereignty. So I'm going to start with a brief review of the literature on sovereignty before looking more closely at how Britain's current trade approach to FTAs may undermine sovereignty. I'll discuss how provisions in FTAs such as public procurement, competition, ISDS, and TRIPS Plus provisions may call into question attempts at regaining full sovereign control. So the limitations imposed by FTAs will be examined through the lens of two significant trade deals, the US-UK trade deal, which is currently being negotiated, and the UK's potential adhesion to the CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the article draws on extensive secondary material, government documents, official speeches and research papers, as well as global governance and state theory literature. So first of all, it's important to understand the complex nature of notions of sovereignty. Sovereignty, of course, is a difficult term to define. Early studies of sovereignty point to the emergence of sovereign rule following the peace treaties in 1648, known collectively as the Peace of Westphalia, which set forth the inviolability of borders and non-interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign states. Brown considers sovereignty to describe both legal and political status, and it refers to the triple capacity of a state with supremacy over domestic affairs, the right to govern over its people, and freedom from outside interference. Now, the political meaning of sovereignty, according to Smith, is the control and administration of a government or governmental entity. Now, while the traditional sense of sovereignty implied the ability of a state to make decisions on domestic policies within its border, free from external interference, globalization has pushed the boundaries of government's abilities to control such decisions. And this is because cooperation among trading partners is essential to support international trade and investment. Free trading areas and free trade agreements have thus become central to trade policy making. And Eliot argues that the whole debate, therefore, on taking back control has been based on the underlying premise that sovereignty can be maintained, preserved, or recovered. Sovereignty is therefore presented as a binary concept, something that a state either possesses or doesn't possess, or something that can be given away or recovered. This really underlines how sovereignty has been misconceived. It's not a binary concept. In fact, accepting that there are limitations on sovereignty by entering into legally binding international arrangements is actually, as Eliot argues, and I quote, a means of exercising sovereignty whereby the legal resources of the state are harnessed in the services of objectives that are judged in political, economic, diplomatic, or other terms to be worthwhile, and critically to warrant the reduced freedom of action thereby entailed. And since departure from the European Union, we might, however, consider to what extent Britain's new trading model may represent somewhat of threat to sovereignty. So in a report written by the House of Lords European Union Select Committee 6 months after the referendum, it's argued that there is necessarily an inherent trade-off between liberalising trade and exercising sovereignty. And in this report, it posits that this was the case when the UK joined the EEC and traded preferential access for sovereignty. And it also states that this will apply, and indeed it does, in light of the UK seeking comprehensive trade relations with the EU and other countries post-Brexit. So sovereignty is necessarily restricted because trade agreements require harmonisation of rules, both products and services, in order to remove tariffs. Now, as an EU member state, we know that the UK was subject to the Court of Justice to the European Union. Now, outside the UK, it's subject to rules which are binding under international law, whether that be on WTO terms or other. And the report, going back to the report of the House of Lords, it concludes that, and I quote, "The notion that a country can have a complete regulatory sovereignty while engaging in comprehensive free trade with partners is based on a misunderstanding of the nature of free trade." And that's because modern FTAs have extensive regulatory harmonization, which are necessary to eliminate, namely non-tariff barriers. The report concludes that the deeper the agreements, the greater the loss of sovereignty will be. And Funk and Song argue that hyperglobalization and democratic politics have made it difficult to achieve national sovereignty because globalization actually constrains domestic economic policy making and results in restricting the domestic policy space. Globalization in many ways is seen as a threat to national sovereignty due to global financial flows, multinational cooperation power, the influence of the internet, etc. Multinationals indeed have a major impact on their source of income. And if a state fails to ensure conditions are right for multinationals, it loses out on global competitiveness. So supranationality is seen as a threat to national sovereignty because it implies a situation whereby an international authority can impose its will on sovereign and independent states. So free trade agreements can strengthen corporate power, and such agreements dictate the rules of trade across the world, in particular in the 21st century. Trade deals, whether they be cross-regional deals, such as CETA, and in the case that we're interested in today, the CPTPP, or bilateral deals, UK-US deal, which have been signed or in progress between the UK and partner countries, attempt to eliminate, reduce, or prevent behind-the-border non-tariff barriers. And as Fimbo underlines, the WTO process has led to a significant number of regional and bilateral agreements being signed, but they have actually raised new issues that have been said to threaten national sovereignty or a government's right to govern on issues of national concern, and namely in areas relating to investment, intellectual property, public services and regulations. So there are specific provisions in trade agreements which increase the power of investors, at the same time limit action of national governments. Before I move on to look at how those impact specifically on the UK in signing negotiation of free trade agreements, I'm just going to pinpoint 2 points which are very important. And the first is investor protection. In particular, investment protection is seen as a threat to national sovereignty because it constitutes external influence on governmental decision-making. Carr defines national sovereignty as the ability of a legitimate government to regulate investment environment within its borders. He draws on Krasner's Westphalian conception of sovereignty. And in this conceptualization, full sovereignty implies a distinct lack of other authority over the state and domestic authority. Fimbo demonstrates that one of the main achievements of transnational actors and networks has been the creation of a regime for investment. Now, the initial investment treaty, bilateral investment treaty regime, emerged in the 1960s. And these agreements involved the creation of a dispute resolution provision, which conferred jurisdiction to the International Court of Justice to decide on disputes for the interpretation or application of an agreement. However, the ISDS provisions have been carefully developed and extended. And the ISDS mechanisms actually allow potential investors to challenge and even sue states if they have real or potential profit losses. The cases are judged in tribunals. And at the beginning, only a few disputes were brought to arbitration process, mainly involving developing states. But the disputes resolution cases have increased significantly over the last few years, as transnational corporations have realized it's actually an effective way of enforcing liberal investment rules. Arguments in favor of ISDS provisions are that they protect investors and provide clear investment rules. and the United Nations states that international investment agreements may offer an avenue for the resolution of investment states disputes that allow significant disagreements to be overcome and the investment relation to survive. So they claim that remedy can also ensure business as usual. But critics see ISDS mechanisms as threats to democracy and public policy, which call into question environmental protection and regulations. Trade unions, NGOs criticize the independence and impartiality of arbitrators. Now, the concern is that the ISDS provisions in trade agreements may allow investors to overturn domestic courts, laws or regulations which are in place to protect public health and well-being. Costly settlements and successful outcomes for investors restrict state decision-making and rights to rules. Examples are notably given in the case of Canada and the US under the NAFTA agreement, whereby Canadian provinces, notably Quebec and New Brunswick, were faced with challenges when they attempted to limit fracking, but there are also many number of contentious cases. So while tribunals will defend reasonable governmental regulation, in a number of cases, we've seen that multinationals have been able to use non-democratically elected international tribunals to sue states for preventing trade and investment. Some analysis have suggested, despite these improvements, the arbitration model still constrains sovereignty and democratic governance. Critics question the provisions of new agreements, of these new trade agreements that are being signed between the UK and partner countries, and their potential to really regulate on these subjects. Another major issue is that of rising drug prices due to the trade deals which have hiked up intellectual property protectionism. The trade-related aspects of international property rights, TRIPS, which was negotiated at the end of the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade between 1989 and 1990, was intended to harmonize intellectual property rights. And the following Doha Declaration on the TRIPS agreement in public health aimed to restore the balance and enable developing countries to have access to essential medicines, or other, in fact, developed countries too, through flexibilities which balanced intellectual property protection and public health imperatives. The US has sought through bilateral and regional trade agreements to reinforce IPR, and many of their bilateral FDAs have included TRIPS plus standards, which demand that the signatory countries agree to tighter IP protection than those of TRIPS within the flexibility, without those aforementioned flexibilities. So the US argument is that the current TRIPS does not provide sufficient protection for pharmaceuticals and recovery of R&D costs. So TRIPS Plus involves a number of provisions which extend patent protection beyond the 20-year period. And the adoption of such provisions actually results in stronger patent protection and leads to static welfare losses, which can result in higher prices for consumers and hence unaffordable drugs. We can see that this is already the case in the US. So widespread use of patents prevent cheap generic versions coming onto the market and bringing down the cost of essential medicines. So there are deep concerns about recent trends to extend patent terms beyond the 20-year TRIPS period through these TRIPS Plus provisions in FTAs. So given these potential restrictions to government's ability to decide on issues of national importance, and more specifically on essential issues such as public health, it's worth considering potential threats from current and future trade deals for the UK, given that all trade deals require partners to change parts of their domestic legislation in order to reduce tariffs. So the UK-US deal, so it was interesting what was said this morning on the renewal of the Atlantic Charter, because up until May, there were reports that the Biden administration didn't see the UK-US deal as a current priority. And my understanding is perhaps this will change. This would change following the current situation and following the meeting today. But the negotiations for a UK-US trade deal were launched on the 5th of March 2020. Now, a UK-US FTA is seen as an important opportunity for the UK to increase trade with its most important trading partner. Before the negotiations began, each partner published its objectives, the US in 2019 and the UK in 2020. Consultations with civil society and the business community have revealed that there is concern that the NHS in a trade deal with the US is a perceivable threat, along with public health more generally. And in addition, the ISDS mechanism, which I went into in some detail just earlier, was mentioned by respondents during the consultations that took place ahead of the publication of their objectives. And Global Justice Now and War on Want to NGOs criticise the ISDS and the fear of creation of a secret courts with legal power going outside the UK legal framework. They actually called for a special grievance mechanism to ensure that individuals, groups or communities could be defended against corporate investors. And the statement about establishing a dispute settlement actually merely underlines that appropriate mechanisms will have to be set up which can promote compliance. As for concerns about the UK's access to affordable medicines following a trade deal with the US, there is also concern about it calling into question the Pharmaceuticals Agreement. The Pharmaceutical Price Regulation Scheme is a voluntary agreement between the Department of Health and Social Care and the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry, which has thus far prevented hikes to medicines. In the UK's positioning paper, it does underline that the UK is committed to the Doha Declaration on Public Health and the TRIPS Agreement, including the agreed. Okay, thank you. It's not very long, this last bit. Including the agreed flexibility to support access to medicines. At the same time, it proposes to uphold competition clauses. Moreover, as regards government procurement, it proposes to go beyond the level set by the WTO Government Procurement Agreement. It does also state that it will provide appropriate regard to public interest, including the need to maintain protection for key public services such as NHS health services. But no mention is made in this document of the intention to exclude TRIPS plus provisions or how to mitigate the potential impact of such clauses on prices negotiated in the NHS. In the overall objectives stated in the objectives document of 2020, the British government states that it intends to exclude price negotiations for drugs, yet it does not explain how the current pricing system will be maintained in the event of inclusion of TRIPS plus provisions in a UK-US trade deal. The US stated in the publication in their objectives of 2019, it was particularly interested in gaining access to the UK food market, alleviating barriers which have thus far reduced US access to agricultural markets. It notably called for the review of non-tariff barriers, good standards which it considers constitutes discrimination against US agricultural goods. But the UK obviously needs to be careful that changing food standards to allow the US to access its agricultural markets will not call into question the EU-UK trade deal if it deviates too far from EU standards. So the proposed UK-US FTA underlines a whole host of possible curtailments on the ability of the British government to act in the national interest in areas of public health and well-being, which raises significant concern. So just on the last point. So the UK is also looking to be part of the mega cross-regional deal, comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Liz Truss underlined how important an opportunity it was. On the 1st of February, Truss announced that the UK had notified the comprehensive progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. We know that that's been accepted and now negotiations have started. This is a agreement which was signed by 11 countries of the Pacific following the withdrawal of the US from the agreements. Australia, notably of interest for the UK, Australia, Canada, Japan, Mexico, and New Zealand. This trading area actually represents 13.5% of world GDP. The initial process for Britain has been to develop bilateral discussions with the 11 member countries already. But in what we're interested in, of course, is how this could represent a curtailment of the UK's sovereign powers. And it's worth noting that the UK would be requesting accession, and therefore its negotiation powers to change the agreement would be limited, and it would have to accept the conditions. So it's a rule taker rather than a rule maker. The other issue is that since the main provisions of the CPTPP were established under the previous framework, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and to which the US was party, the standards and regulations are based on a US system of standards and certification procedures, which are different from the EU. So it would need to adhere or find balance for these regulatory regimes. It also involves all the aforementioned threats relating to investor-state dispute mechanism, reinforced IP protection, given that it's based on US-style agreements. And finally, I think I'm going to have to quickly sum up there because I've run out of time.
Sorry about that.
So very 30 seconds or 20-second conclusion. So it seems clear that the above discussion, that the changing nature of the world trade means that the UK's notion of sovereignty, promoted by the likes of Boris Johnson and the Brexiteers, is very much misconceived and outdated. And the reservations made by the House of Lords EU Select Committee in 2016 following the referendum have clearly proved to be correct. It would seem that the UK has traded one kind of constraint on sovereignty for another.
Okay, thank you very much, Louise. Sorry about the time constraints.
No, I'm sorry, I went over.
That's okay, that's fine. Right, well, we'll open it up then to any questions that any of you might like to put on any of these three papers, of course. No, don't be shy.
I have a question for Tommaso.
Yes, Mark.
So I was wondering to what extent Carr talks about the European empires in this process of planning and reconstruction, because obviously that's something that becomes a main rub of the Atlantic Charter, and in a way I think this applies also for David and Louise's papers. I mean, for David, to what extent were kind of ongoing British transfers of power, decolonization, whatever terms you want to talk about, brought up in the discussions with Carter. And then for Louise, I mean, I'm just struck by to what extent is this kind of free trade regime, which is its own kind of regime rather than a restoration of national sovereignty, to what extent is this a result of kind of like the Lomé discussions that David touched on, these trade agreements that are part of the kind of the deals that are made in the transfers of power in the European empires. Yeah.
Okay, Tommaso, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you very much for your question. I mean, you are right. I mean, this was an important element, not only in Carr's thinking about the evolution of the international system in general, and you can actually find much more on imperial issues in Nationalism and After, but still, if you like, the thrust of his argument could be found in Conditions of Peace as well, but also in the way the book was reviewed, I mean, and received by public intellectuals as well as politicians in Britain. The fact that Carr was called an active danger in the House of Lords had a lot to do with what seemed to be his tendency to encourage Britain to move away from a vision and a foreign policy agenda to narrowly focus on empires, and even more, to his tendency to claim that eventually, traditional empires, including the British Empire, will have to be replaced, but a kind of more sort of egalitarian settlement, if you like. I don't believe Conditions of Peace can be regarded as an anti-imperial book. There is an interesting section of the book, for example, which underscores the fact that Britain's interests and Britain's obligation to regional stability in Europe nevertheless had to be balanced with its wider commitment towards the Commonwealth, for example. And the position, again, is not as one-sided as it has often been read. But obviously, if one follows the logic of Carr's argument, and if one notices that he clearly explains in his book that any kind of future international order involving some sort of supranational pooling of resources at regional level will have to be built on fundamentally on an egalitarian basis, and would be, in a sense, a system of regional blocks in which living standards would be equalized and no specific national unit would be able to take the lion's shares of the resources of the bloc. Then, of course, this kind of argument and this kind of vision could hardly be reconciled with any thoroughgoing defense of the British Empire as it was organized at the time Carr's book came out. So, in a nutshell, this was not a book aimed at claiming that Britain had to do away with its empire, but there were obvious implications in the general argument that Carr made about how the international system would be and could be reorganized, that in a way called into questions many of the underpinning assumptions that could be found in arguments in favor of the maintenance of the British Empire.
Thank you. David, Louise?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for the question, Mark. Certainly the issue of decolonization looms large over any discussions of sort of British engagement with the emerging human rights system during the post-war period. So if we look at, for instance, the work of Fabian Closer, who has looked at how both within Britain and France, emerging sort of human rights discourse was seen as a source of embarrassment. It was something to sort of be discussed in hushed tones, lest it be sort of weaponized by sort of anti-colonial leaders or wider international opinion. However, by the time we get to the sort of mid-1960s and the first Wilson government, you start to see a more proactive, positive engagement with sort of human rights within the fora of the United Nations. Kind of Britain starts to move a little bit off the defensive. And I think this is, was it A.W.B. Simpson has written about this, looking at, this relationship between decolonization and sort of British engagement with human rights, and demonstrates quite clearly this sort of inversely proportional relationship between, the dissolution of Britain's sort of colonial responsibilities and its increasing engagement with sort of human rights discourse during the post-war period. So by the time that we get to Owen, and you reference, does this kind of play a role in, Anglo-American discussions of human rights? Not really, and I'd say that it's by this stage it's kind of reversed. I'm thinking about the one sort of aspect of Anglo-American kind of cooperation in the human rights field that touches on this issue directly during this period, and that would be the Anglo-American proposals for Rhodesia at the time, which were very much seen on both sides of the Atlantic as a human rights issue. So you kind of have Owen sort of not so much on the defensive about human rights because of Britain's colonial past, rather he feels the need to kind of really be proactive in bringing the curtain down on the British Empire in Africa, sort of by sort of using the language of human rights and framing this as part of a kind of mutual Anglo-American commitment to sort of raising the profile of human rights. I think part of this has to do with, as I mentioned in the paper, Owen's kind of post-colonial vintage. I mean, he was only 38 years old by the time that he becomes Foreign Secretary. In my discussions with Owen, he said that, while he saw this, the Rhodesian question very much through a human rights lens, kind of a more senior sort of level of diplomat tended not to. I think Owen was very much kind of attuned to the sort of increasing engagement with human rights and sort of uptick in grassroots and NGO engagement with human rights sort of during the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so, yeah, it's by the stage that we get to the Owen sort of Carter axis on human rights, the issue of decolonization is no longer sort of problematizing Britain's ability to kind of, take a moral lead, or at least try and position itself as a moral leader on the international stage through the language of human rights.
Yes, Louise.
Thank you very much for that question, very interesting. Well, we know that the proliferation of free trade agreements in the late 20th, 21st century is due to the limitations of the multilateral trading system. But at the same time, the Atlantic Charter, one of the that actually did lead and inspire the creation of the whole GATT system so effectively, and all these provisions in comprehensive trade agreements that we see currently do include behind the board issues, human rights, questions of democracy, health, etc. So I think indeed you can see that there is definitely a link there, and it'd be interesting to see whether the current statement, the current Atlantic Charter, whether that will actually kickstart again these agreements, the UK-US trade agreement, which is since the Biden administration came, it's really started to wane as such, and it was really, there were 5 rounds of negotiations, and it's somewhat stalled. So that'd be interesting to see how it develops and the influence, obviously, the new Atlantic Charter. But very interesting, and I think it's worth perhaps that would be a good way to start the paper, actually. So thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot my microphone was off. So yeah, thank you. And as Melanie has just helpfully reminded us, you can use the virtual hand option to raise your hand if you'd like to come in, or write your question directly in the chat. But if anyone would like, anyone else has anything to ask to our first panelists?
I'll go then.
Melanie, yeah, go.
Yes, well, thank you, and I'll take my my hand down now. Thank you very much to all 3 of you. It's really really fascinating papers. I suppose my question was probably, was more directly linked to David's paper. Your discussion of the connections between aid and foreign policy was really interesting, and obviously has very immediate and contemporary echoes in the debates as we know. But so I suppose I had 2 questions. I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more perhaps about how Owen's views on aid fitted in within, perhaps more broadly, within the government at the time, or maybe even actually the party. I mean, in other words, was it a consensual view that he was proposing? And my second question is more related to the positions that the French and the Germans had on it, and the tensions between Owen's desires and what his French and German counterparts were proposing. Would you say that it was more differences in a general conception of what international aid should be, or in the case of Uganda that you were discussing, was it more specifically to do with either Uganda or perhaps more generally about foreign policy in Africa at the time. So how really where the difference in approach, you would say, really where it really lay.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so as regards the relationship between human rights and aid, I'd say those kind of discussions weren't really led by Owen. I mean, Owen is very much at the forefront of the elevation of human rights diplomacy kind of within Britain at this time. However, this kind of sort of related discussions happening contemporaneously. So I'd say, as regards the relationship between human rights and aid, Judith Hart, who was Minister for Overseas Development, is very much engaged with this question of sort of rights-based development during this period, as is Frank Judd, who was Owen's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, somebody who Owen later described as his conscience during his time at the Foreign Office. And Hart in particular is really engaged with emerging debates about the new international economic order, and proposals emerging from the G77 regarding sort of rights-based approaches to development. And both Judd and Hart view this as a kind of, well, they view human rights as a means of kind of articulating an overtly socialist foreign policy. Owen perhaps less so. But yeah, in terms of the kind of the relationship between human rights and development, as it's being driven by various Labour ministers, it's being done so, it's being subsumed by this idea of articulating a broader sort of socialist foreign policy. So I'd say discussions of kind of Lone and Uganda can't really be sort of so easily separated from that, although the Ugandan issue was a particular focus for Britain, having sort of severed diplomatic ties in 76. Because what I didn't sort of wasn't able to kind of mention in the paper was that issue really sort of ranks above any other engagements within the EC that Britain had sort of regarding this conversation, this link between aid and sort of human rights. So perhaps not to say that it was a cynical move to engage so sort of vociferously with the Ugandan issue, but it was a little bit of a one-off in some regards. But as I say, that behind sort of Owen's kind of grand human rights rhetoric, there were sort of discussions developing elsewhere within the Labour government and within the Foreign Office that were very much engaged with emerging debates about the new international economic order and the desire to sort of frame human rights as a sort of socialist foreign policy, or a mechanism of advancing a socialist foreign policy. Although once you get into the Thatcher years, this connection between human rights and aid is very quickly downgraded. And what you get is human rights effectively stays on the diplomatic agenda, but it's increasingly tied to concepts of, exclusively tied to concepts of civil and political liberties, and is increasingly removed from discussions of socioeconomic distributive justice, and is increasingly weaponized in the context of the East-West dialogue. So you can, so when viewed in that perspective, the kind of avowedly socialist sort of aspects of this human rights uptick become more clear, I think.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any hands raised, but is there anything anyone would like to ask? No, I'll put just a very quick question to Louise then, because all three papers have explored in different and interesting ways issues of compatibility, in a sense, in the relations of Britain with two of its major partners in that idea of that Churchillian idea of the three spheres. And so you mentioned, Louise, that there was the issue of ensuring that free trade agreements negotiated by the UK would have to be compatible with the norms required by the European Union for access of British produce to the European market. And I was just wondering simply to what extent do you think that is actually feasible, and to what extent do you think that a UK-US free trade agreement or British accession to the CPTPP are possible, are compatible with continued British access to the European market?
Yeah, thank you for that question. In terms of the UK-US trade deal, in the published objectives, it was indicated that the UK would uphold its standards in terms of agricultural standards, food standards. So that's going to be a process which will be quite long, and negotiations are expected to be long and drawn out. There is also the issue of, I mentioned before, the TRIPS Plus provisions and what impact that will have on price regimes. There is actually we do have a precedent with the Australian US FTA, where there was an extra provision which provided that Australia has a fairly similar pharmaceuticals price regime to the UK, and they insisted on an extra provision to say that those standards could be upheld. But in following years, there were actually reforms to the pharmaceutical pricing regime, which seems to have been to be able to align more closely to the US style of system. Yeah, there's very much a potential there will be very difficult, but even so, even if the negotiations end in including this provision, the UK will have to ensure that this does not mean that there is a calling into question of pharmaceuticals regulation regime. The CPTPP, that's another issue as well. It's again going to be a negotiation that will be long and drawn out because of this fear that if we move away too far from the standards of the EU, then the imposed, we'll see that we're actually calling into question the agreement with the FTA. So yeah, I mean, these are going to be processes which are long and drawn out and very complex issues to solve.
Yes, all the more so, I suppose, as you said, the CPTPP already exists. It's already been negotiated by the 11 existing partners, and the UK has very little latitude to renegotiate aspects of it. Okay. Yes, Mark, I think we have time for one last question. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Adrien. So my question is for Louise. So you've shown that the rhetoric of the Brexit campaign was that we could take back control of our trade policies, and that in reality, free trade agreements often go against notions of sovereignty. Could you tell us if other parties in Britain show awareness of these issues? So outside of the Brexit campaign, are there parties in Parliament, outside of Parliament, that show awareness of the dangers for sovereignty of those trade agreements, and specifically the ones that you discussed with the United States?
Yeah, it's mainly civil society associations which are calling to question these free trade agreements and pointing to threats to public health. I mentioned just a few, but there are also all the health organizations, the European Health Organization, we've seen that that's an issue. Several, so I mentioned the war on want, yeah, I mean, it's mainly, as I say, the civil society associations which are calling into question these trade agreements. Obviously, we saw as well that the Labour government, when there was a leak, that the NHS would be actually finally part of the trade deal between the UK and US. We saw that through Corbyn's statement. I don't know whether you're aware of that controversy, but indeed there are other political parties which are particularly concerned about the issue of the NHS in free trade agreements. So, but it's mainly civil society organisations, health groups, European Alliance on Health, which are concerned about these issues. Yeah.